The cold barrel of a revolver pressed against Marlene Winfield's temple as her husband growled through gritted teeth. "Try to leave again, and I'll make sure they find your body in pieces." In the flickering candlelight of their isolated cabin, his eyes reflected nothing but hollow darkness, the same darkness that had consumed their 3 years of marriage in the unforgiving Montana territory of 1878. Marlene's hands trembled as she nodded silently, her throat too tight with fear to form words. This wasn't the first time Edgar had threatened her life, but something in his voice told her it might be the last warning she would receive. The bruises hidden beneath her high-necked dress throbbed with each terrified heartbeat as Edgar finally lowered the gun and stomped out to the barn, leaving her alone with her racing thoughts and the distant howl of coyotes. 3 years ago, at 18, she'd believed Edgar Winfield's promises of adventure and prosperity when he'd courted her in St. Louis. Her parents had encouraged the match, impressed by the 30-year-old businessman's talk of opportunity in the Western Territories. They never saw the transformation that occurred once Marlene was isolated on his remote homestead, far from neighbors or family, where Edgar's true nature emerged like a rattlesnake from hiding. As she listened to his boots crunching through the November frost, Marlene made her decision. Edgar would be leaving at dawn for Helena to conduct business, a 3-day journey each way. It might be her last chance to escape before the harsh Montana winter trapped her completely. She waited until his snores filled their small bedroom before silently gathering what little she could carry: a spare dress, her mother's cameo brooch, the meager savings she'd managed to hide beneath a loose floorboard. Each movement was measured, practiced in her mind 100 times during sleepless nights of planning. By the time the first hint of gray touched the eastern sky, Marlene had everything bundled in a small cloth sack. Edgar departed with barely a word, his breath visible in the frigid morning air as he mounted his horse. "Mind the place," he ordered flatly. "I'll be back before the week's end." Marlene nodded obediently, fighting to keep her expression neutral despite the hammering of her heart. She watched him disappear down the winding trail until she was certain he wouldn't turn back, then rushed inside to implement her plan. She knew she couldn't take the wagon; it would be too slow, too obvious. Instead, she changed into her sturdiest dress, laced her boots tightly, and pulled on every layer she owned. The November chill would be merciless, but the fear of staying was greater than the fear of the elements. With trembling fingers, she pinned her honey-brown hair beneath a worn bonnet and stepped out into the crisp morning air with nothing but her small bundle and the desperate hope for freedom. Marlene had overheard Edgar mention Silver Creek, a growing settlement about 30 miles south. If she maintained a steady pace and followed the creek, she might reach it in 2 days, maybe 3. What would happen after that, she couldn't say. Perhaps she could find work as a seamstress or in one of the boarding houses. Anything would be better than waiting for the day Edgar's threats became reality. The first hours of her journey passed in a blur of adrenaline and determination. The rolling terrain of the valley gave her some cover as she followed game trails and kept the distant mountains as her guide. By midday, she had put several miles between herself and the cabin, though the biting wind had already begun to penetrate her layers. Still, Marlene pressed on, pausing only briefly to drink from the icy creek and chew on the hard biscuits she'd brought. As afternoon faded into evening, dark clouds gathered on the horizon, bringing with them the unmistakable scent of approaching snow. Marlene felt the first flakes against her cheeks as dusk descended, transforming the landscape into an increasingly treacherous maze of shadows. She needed shelter for the night, but the open valley offered little protection, Exhaustion began to take its toll as the temperature dropped precipitously. Her fingers had grown numb inside her thin gloves, and each step became more laborious than the last. The snow was falling heavily now, accumulating on her shoulders and obscuring the path ahead. "Just a little farther," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible above the whistling wind. Just a little farther, but how much farther could she go? The darkness was nearly complete now, and the snow was quickly covering her tracks. If she became disoriented in the storm, she might wander in circles until the cold claimed her entirely. The thought of dying alone in the wilderness sent a fresh wave of panic through her veins, yet even that seemed preferable to returning to Edgar's cruel hands. Squinting through the swirling snow, Marlene spotted what appeared to be a large rock formation ahead. If she could reach it, perhaps she could find some shelter from the relentless wind. With renewed determination, she trudged forward, her boots sinking deeper into the accumulating snow with each step. The rock formation gradually took shape as she approached not just boulders, but what appeared to be the remains of an old mining operation dug into the hillside. A small wooden structure leaned precariously against the rocky outcropping, its door hanging by a single hinge. Marlene stumbled toward it, her legs nearly giving out as she pushed open the creaking door and collapsed inside. The abandoned miner's shack offered little comfort: a dirt floor, gaps in the walls where the wind whistled through, and the lingering smell of damp and decay. But it was shelter, however meager, and for that she was grateful. Using the last of her strength, she pulled the door closed as best she could and huddled in the corner, wrapping her arms around herself in a futile attempt to conserve warmth. As the temperature continued to plummet and the storm raged outside, Marlene felt the dangerous pull of sleep tugging at her consciousness. She fought against it, knowing that surrendering to that impulse could mean never waking again. "Stay awake," she murmured repeatedly, pinching her arms and stamping her feet. But the cold was relentless, seeping into her bones and dulling her senses. As her eyelids grew heavier, Marlene thought of all she had endured and all she had hoped for in her desperate flight. Was this to be her fate after all? To escape one death only to find another? The irony of it might have made her laugh if she'd had the strength. Instead, she found herself slipping into a dangerous twilight state, neither fully conscious nor completely gone. Through the fog of encroaching hypothermia, Marlene became vaguely aware of a sound outside: not just the howling wind, but something more purposeful. Footsteps crunching through snow. The nickering of a horse. Was it Edgar? Had he somehow discovered her absence and tracked her through the storm? The thought sent a jolt of fear through her, momentarily clearing her mind. The door of the shack suddenly flew open, letting in a swirl of snow and a tall, broad-shouldered silhouette. Marlene tried to shrink deeper into the shadows, but her stiff limbs refused to cooperate. She was trapped, cornered like an animal, too weak even to run. "Hello?" A deep voice called, not Edgar's voice, she realized with a flood of relief. "Is someone in here?" The figure moved forward, and in the dim light filtering through the doorway, Marlene could make out the features of a man she'd never seen before. He wore a heavy sheepskin coat dusted with snow, and a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the wind. His face, partially illuminated by the lantern he carried, showed surprise as he spotted her. "Madam," he said, his voice softening as he took in her huddled form. "Good Lord, what are you doing out here in this storm?" Marlene tried to answer, but her lips were too numb to form coherent words. Only a weak sound escaped her throat as she stared up at the stranger with a mixture of fear and desperate hope. The man quickly assessed her condition, setting his lantern on the ground and kneeling beside her. "You're half frozen," he said, concern evident in his voice. Without hesitation, He shrugged out of his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, then produced a thick woolen blanket from his saddlebag, which he tucked carefully around her trembling form. "My name's Samuel Blackwood," he said, his breath visible in the cold air of the shack. "I've got a cabin not far from here. Can you stand? We need to get you warmed up before this cold does permanent damage." Marlene managed a slight nod, though standing seemed an impossible task. Samuel seemed to understand her limitations without further explanation. With gentle efficiency, he gathered her into his arms, blanket and all, and carried her out into the storm to where his horse waited, stamping impatiently in the deepening snow. "Hold on tight now," he instructed as he lifted her onto the saddle before mounting behind her. His strong arms encircled her as he took the reins, providing additional warmth and security as they set off through the blizzard. Marlene drifted in and out of awareness during the journey, conscious only of the steady rhythm of the horse beneath them and the solid presence of the man who held her upright. She should have been terrified trusting a stranger in such vulnerability, when against every instinct yet something about Samuel Blackwood's quiet competence quieted her fears. Whatever awaited her at his cabin couldn't be worse than freezing to death alone in the abandoned mine shack. After what seemed both an eternity and only moments, they arrived at a small but sturdy log cabin nestled among a stand of pine trees. Samuel dismounted swiftly, helped her down, and guided her inside, where blessed warmth from a banked fire greeted them. "Let's get you warmed up," he said, leading her to a chair near the hearth. He added several logs to the fire, which quickly blazed to life, casting golden light throughout the simple but tidy one-room cabin. "Can you tell me your name, madam?" "Marlene," she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Marlene Winfield. Miss Winfield, you're safe now," Samuel assured her as he moved efficiently around the cabin, putting a kettle on the cast iron stove and gathering additional blankets. "But I need to know if you're hurt anywhere, or if there's someone looking for you." The question sparked immediate anxiety in Marlene's thawing consciousness. She clutched the blanket tighter around herself. "My husband," she whispered. "He doesn't know I've gone. He's away, but he'll be back in days. He'll come looking." Samuel's expression darkened slightly as his eyes took in the fading bruise visible at her jawline, a souvenir from Edgar's last outburst that even her high collar couldn't completely hide. Understanding seemed to dawn in his eyes, but he asked no further questions on the matter. "You're a long way from anywhere," he observed instead, pouring steaming water into a mug and adding dried herbs. "Here, drink this. It'll help warm you from inside." Marlene accepted the tea with trembling hands, the warmth of the mug almost painful against her cold fingers. "I was trying to reach Silver Creek," she explained hesitantly. Samuel nodded. "That's still about 20 miles south. You wouldn't have made it in this storm." He paused, studying her with kind but concerned eyes. "The pass to Silver Creek will be blocked for days after this snow. You're welcome to stay here until it clears, if you've a mind to." The unexpected kindness brought tears to Marlene's eyes. She had prepared herself for many outcomes in her desperate flight, but not for compassion from a stranger. "Why would you help me?" she asked, suspicion born of hard experience momentarily overriding her gratitude. Samuel's weathered face softened. "My sister was in a situation not unlike yours once," he said simply. "I couldn't help her then. Perhaps helping you now is God's way of giving me another chance." His honesty disarmed her. Marlene nodded slowly, allowing herself to relax marginally as the warmth of the fire and tea began to thaw her frozen body. For the first time in years, she felt a tentative sense of safety. "Thank you," she whispered, meeting his gaze directly. "For the blanket, and for finding me." Samuel nodded, a gentle smile touching his lips. "Get some rest, Mrs. Winfield. Tomorrow we'll figure out what comes next." As Marlene drifted into an exhausted sleep in the chair by the fire, the woolen blanket wrapped securely around her, she couldn't know that this chance encounter, this act of simple human kindness, would become the first page in an entirely new chapter of her life. The blanket that now warmed her would come to represent far more than mere protection from the cold. It would become the first thread in a tapestry of hope, healing, and eventually, love. Dawn broke cold and clear the next morning, revealing a transformed landscape outside Samuel Blackwood's cabin. Nearly 2 feet of pristine snow blanketed the surroundings, with drifts piled even higher against the north-facing walls. Inside, Marlene awakened slowly, momentarily disoriented by unfamiliar surroundings until the events of the previous day came rushing back. She found herself lying on a narrow but comfortable bed against the far wall of the cabin, still wrapped in the woolen blanket. Samuel had apparently moved her there while she slept, though he was nowhere to be seen now. A fresh fire crackled in the hearth, and the delicious aroma of coffee and something cooking made her stomach growl with unexpected hunger. Cautiously, Marlene sat up, wincing at the stiffness in her limbs, a painful reminder of her desperate journey through the snow. Her boots had been removed and placed neatly by the fire to dry, while her outer layers hung from pegs near the hearth. The thought of this stranger handling her clothing while she slept should have alarmed her, but something about Samuel Blackwood's straightforward manner had earned a measure of trust she hadn't expected to give. The cabin door swung open, admitting a blast of cold air and Samuel himself, his arms laden with firewood. "Good morning," he greeted her, nudging the door closed with his boot. "Glad to see you awake. How are you feeling?" "Better, thank you," Marlene replied, pulling the blanket more securely around her shoulders as she took stock of her physical condition. "Though everything aches." Samuel nodded sympathetically as he stacked the wood beside the fireplace. "Not surprising after what you've been through. You're lucky you didn't lose fingers or toes to the cold." He moved to the small cast iron stove where a pot bubbled. "I've made some breakfast. Nothing fancy, just porridge with dried apples and a bit of honey." The simple kindness of this offering, food prepared for her without expectation or demand, brought an unexpected lump to Marlene's throat. Edgar had never once cooked for her. Such tasks were women's work, and her failure to perform them to his exacting standards had often resulted in violence. "Thank you," she managed, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. Her stockinged feet touched the wooden floor, which was surprisingly warm thanks to the heat from the nearby fire. Samuel filled 2 bowls and brought one to her, along with a steaming cup of coffee. "You mentioned Silver Creek yesterday," he said as he settled into a chair across from her with his own breakfast. "Do you have family there?" Marlene shook her head, wrapping her cold fingers around the warm bowl. "No, I don't have family anywhere in the territory. I needed to go somewhere, and I'd heard my husband mention Silver Creek had work for women at the hotel and laundry." Samuel studied her thoughtfully as he ate. He was younger than she'd initially thought, probably in his late 20s, with intelligent blue eyes and a strong, clean-shaven jaw. His light brown hair fell in waves that brushed his collar, and though his hands were roughened by work, there was a gentleness to his movements that spoke of a man comfortable in his own skin. "Silver Creek's growing fast with the silver strike last spring," he confirmed. "But it's no place for a woman alone, especially with winter setting in. Most of the men there are single miners or cowboys, and the few respectable establishments are already staffed for the season." Marlene's heart sank. Her plan, tenuous as it had been, now seemed hopelessly naive. "I have nowhere else to go," she admitted quietly. and will not return to my husband." Samuel nodded, seeming to accept this without judgment. "The storms blocked the pass south for now anyway," he said practically. "And I expect your husband will be looking for you once he returns and finds you gone. Traveling right away might not be the safest course." The thought of Edgar's rage when he discovered her absence sent a chill through Marlene that had nothing to do with the winter cold. He would search for her, of that she had no doubt, and what he would do when he found her didn't bear thinking about. "I don't want to impose on your kindness," she said, though the prospect of venturing out again filled her with dread. "Perhaps once the weather clears, you're welcome to stay here until spring if need be," Samuel interrupted, his tone matter of fact. "I've plenty of supplies, and an extra pair of hands around the place would be helpful. I run a small trap line in winter and do some prospecting in the warmer months. Nothing that's made me rich, but enough to get by." Marlene stared at him, bewildered by the offer. "You don't know me," she pointed out. "I could be anyone." A slight smile touched Samuel's lips. "You're a woman running from a man who hurt you," he said simply. "That tells me enough about your character and his to make my decision." He rose and carried his empty bowl to a basin of water. "Besides, the cabin gets mighty quiet in winter. Some company would be welcome." There was no hidden meaning in his words, no suggestion of impropriety. Just a straightforward offer of sanctuary from a man who seemed genuinely concerned for her welfare. Still, Marlene hesitated, weighing her limited options against her instinctive caution. What would people think? A woman staying alone with a man she's not married to. Samuel looked thoughtful. "My nearest neighbors are the Petersons, about 5 miles east. Good people. If it eases your mind, I could ride over once the trail clears and explain the situation. Martha Peterson is about your size. She might have some spare clothing you could borrow too." The consideration behind this suggestion surprised Marlene. Edgar had never once considered her comfort or reputation, caring only for appearances when it suited his purposes. "I can cook and clean," she offered hesitantly, "and so, I was a seamstress before I married." "Then we'll manage just fine," Samuel said with finality. "Now you should rest more today. Your body's been through an ordeal." Over the next several days, as the landscape remained locked in winter's grip, Marlene gradually regained her strength. True to his word, Samuel rode to the Peterson homestead when the weather allowed, returning with a bundle of clothing from Martha Peterson and an invitation for Marlene to visit when she felt stronger. "Martha was concerned for you," Samuel reported as he hung his snow-dusted coat by the door. "Said any woman was welcome at their table, especially one who'd had a hard time of it." Marlene felt a surge of gratitude at this extension of female solidarity from a woman she'd never met. Perhaps there was hope for her in this rugged territory after all. As the days passed, she and Samuel established a comfortable routine. He would rise before dawn to check his trap lines, returning mid-morning with whatever small game he'd caught. Marlene would have coffee waiting and would prepare meals from the well-stocked pantry. In the afternoons, Samuel would chop wood or tend to repairs around the cabin while Marlene mended clothing or helped with indoor tasks. Their conversation, initially limited to practical matters, gradually expanded as Marlene's trust grew. She learned that Samuel had come west from Pennsylvania 5 years earlier, that he'd been a Union soldier despite his youth during the latter years of the Civil War, and that he preferred the solitude of the mountains to the growing settlements in the valleys. "My father wanted me to follow him into the law," he explained one evening as they sat before the fire, Marlene darning a sock while Samuel cleaned his rifle. "But after the war, I couldn't stomach being confined between 4 walls. Too many men died for me to waste my life doing something that brought me no joy." Your family didn't mind you coming west, Marlene asked. A shadow crossed Samuel's face. My parents passed within a year of each other after I returned from the war. My sister married and moved to California with her husband. We write, but I haven't seen her in years. He paused, his hand stilling on the rifle. What about your family, Marlene? Do they know what's happened to you? The question opened a well of sorrow Marlene had kept tightly capped. My father died when I was 16. Mother struggled afterward. We had a small dressmaking business in St. Louis, but it barely sustained us. She sighed, remembering her mother's relief when Edgar Winfield had begun calling. When Edgar proposed, it seemed like providence. He spoke of opportunity in Montana territory, of building a life together. Mother was so pleased to see me settled before she passed. And when did you discover the man wasn't what he appeared? Samuel asked gently. Marlene's fingers tightened on her darning. On our wedding night, she admitted quietly, he was. Different once we were alone, demanding. When I cried, he struck me for the first time. She swallowed hard against the painful memory. He apologized the next day, blamed it on wedding nerves and too much whiskey. But it happened again and again, until the apologies stopped altogether. Samuel's expression hardened, though his voice remained calm. Some men aren't fit to be called men at all, he said. Your husband sounds like one of them. Ex-husband, Marlene corrected firmly, surprising herself with the declaration. I may not have papers to prove it, but I consider myself free of that marriage. A smile of approval warmed Samuel's eyes. As you should. As December deepened toward Christmas, Marlene found herself settling into life at the cabin with unexpected ease. The fear of Edgar's pursuit never quite left her, but it receded into the background as days passed with no sign of danger. She began to sleep through the night without nightmares, to laugh at Samuel's dry humor, to feel something approaching contentment in their shared routine. Samuel, for his part, maintained a respectful distance while still treating her with a quiet courtesy that gradually healed some of the wounds Edgar had inflicted on her spirit. He never raised his voice, never made demands, and always asked rather than assumed when it came to her time or efforts. One afternoon, while Samuel was out checking his traps, Marlene decided to bake bread, a small luxury they hadn't indulged in since her arrival. As she kneaded the dough on the small table, humming softly to herself, the cabin door suddenly burst open. Marlene whirled around, her heart leaping into her throat, expecting to see Edgar's enraged face. Instead, Samuel stood in the doorway, his expression tight with concern. Someone's been asking about you in Silver Creek, he said without preamble, stomping snow from his boots. I ran into Jim Peterson on the trail. He'd just come from town and said a man matching your husband's description was offering a reward for information about a runaway wife. The blood drained from Marlene's face as her worst fears materialized. How did he track me this far? She whispered, her hands unconsciously clenching into fists in the bread dough. He may not know exactly where you are, Samuel reasoned, moving farther into the cabin and closing the door behind him. But he's smart enough to guess you'd head for the nearest settlement. Jim said he told your husband he hadn't seen anyone matching your description, but not everyone in Silver Creek is as honorable. Marlene sagged against the table, her mind racing with terrifying possibilities. I should leave, she said, panic rising in her voice. I've put you in danger by staying here. If Edgar finds out you've sheltered me, you're not going anywhere, Samuel cut in, his tone brooking no argument. Especially not alone in winter. Besides, I can handle myself with the likes of Edgar Winfield. You don't know him, Marlene insisted. He's dangerous when crossed. So am I, Samuel replied simply. He crossed to the window and peered out at the snow-covered landscape, his profile sharp against the gray December light. But we should be more careful. No trips to the Petersons for a while, and I'll vary my trap lines so I'm not following the same pattern each day. The matter-of-fact way he addressed the threat both reassured and troubled Marlene. She didn't want violence, had seen enough of it to last a lifetime, but the thought of facing Edgar without protection terrified her more. "What if he finds us?" she asked, voicing her deepest fear. Samuel turned from the window, his expression resolute. "Then he'll learn that some women aren't meant to be owned or controlled," he said. "And that some men still believe in defending those who can't defend themselves." The simple declaration, delivered without bravado or posturing, resonated deep within Marlene's soul. For the first time, she allowed herself to acknowledge what had been growing between them over these weeks of shared solitude, a tentative trust that went beyond mere gratitude or convenience. "Thank you," she said softly, "for everything." Samuel's expression softened. "You don't need to thank me for treating you with the respect you deserve, Marlene." But she did need to thank him, because respect was something she'd forgotten she deserved, until Samuel Blackwood had reminded her with his quiet dignity and unwavering kindness. The blanket he'd wrapped around her that first night had warmed more than her frozen body. It had begun to thaw the ice around her heart as well. As Christmas approached, the threat of Edgar's search hung over them like a shadow, yet paradoxically drew them closer together. Samuel taught Marlene to shoot his spare revolver, patiently guiding her through the basics until she could hit a pine cone at 10 paces. Marlene, in turn, used her seamstress skills to secretly craft a new shirt for Samuel from fabric she'd found in his modest supplies, working on it during the hours he was out checking his traps. On Christmas Eve, Samuel returned from his rounds with a small pine tree strapped to his back, its fragrant needles filling the cabin with the scent of the forest. "It's not much," he admitted as he secured it in a bucket of sand in the corner, "but Christmas deserves some acknowledgement, even out here." Marlene watched him with a curious mixture of emotions. Edgar had never bothered with Christmas traditions, dismissing them as frivolous wastes of time. Yet here was Samuel, this solitary mountain man, bringing a touch of celebration into their isolated existence. "It's perfect," she said sincerely. From scraps of fabric and bits of twine, she fashioned simple ornaments to hang on the branches, while Samuel contributed a star he'd whittled from pine for the top. That evening, by the light of extra candles Samuel had saved for the occasion, they shared a special meal of venison stew and the last of the dried apple pie Marlene had made the previous week. Afterward, Samuel surprised her by producing a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Merry Christmas, Marlene," he said, a hint of shyness in his usually confident manner as he handed it to her. Stunned, Marlene carefully unwrapped the package to reveal a beautiful tortoiseshell comb for her hair. "Samuel," she breathed, running her fingers over the polished surface. "It's lovely." "I picked it up in Helena last time I was there," he explained. "Thought it might suit you, but never had reason to give it to anyone until now." The simple gift, chosen before he'd even met her yet somehow perfect for her, brought tears to Marlene's eyes. "I have something for you too," she admitted, retrieving the carefully wrapped shirt from her hiding place beneath the bed. Samuel's genuine delight at her gift touched her deeply. He immediately shed his old, patched shirt and donned the new one, the deep blue fabric highlighting his eyes as he moved his shoulders appreciatively. "No one's made something just for me since my mother passed," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you." In that moment, as they sat before the fire with the simple decorated tree lending its fragrance to the cabin, Marlene felt a sense of rightness and belonging she'd never experienced before, not with Edgar, not even in her childhood home. This wasn't just shelter from a storm or protection from danger. It was the foundation of something she'd never dared hope for. A true partnership built on mutual respect and growing affection. When Samuel moved to bank the fire for the night, their hands brushed briefly. The contact sent a different kind of warmth through Marlene, not the desperate, fearful attraction Edgar had demanded, but something gentler and far more powerful. Samuel seemed to feel it too, for he hesitated, his gaze meeting hers with a question he didn't voice. Marlene answered by not pulling away, by allowing her fingers to remain touching his for a heartbeat longer than necessary. "Merry Christmas, Samuel," she said softly, a world of meaning in the simple phrase. "Merry Christmas, Marlene," he replied, his smile lighting something deep within her that had long been cold. That night, as snow fell gently outside and the fire cast dancing shadows across the cabin walls, Marlene slept more peacefully than she had in years, the tortoiseshell comb carefully placed beside her pillow, like a talisman of hope. The days following Christmas passed in a peaceful rhythm that felt increasingly like normalcy to Marlene. January brought deeper snow and colder temperatures, which further isolated their cabin, but also provided a sense of security. If the weather made it difficult for Samuel to travel far, it would likewise hamper Edgar's search. One particularly frigid evening, as they sat before the fire engaged in their usual quiet activities, Samuel carving a new pipe from applewood, Marlene mending a tear in one of his wool shirts, he broke their comfortable silence with an unexpected question. "What would you do if you were truly free, Marlene? If Edgar were no longer a threat and you could choose any life you wanted?" The question startled her. She had been so focused on escape, on survival, that she'd scarcely allowed herself to contemplate a future beyond immediate safety. She set her mending aside, considering thoughtfully. "I'd like to have my own dressmaking shop someday," she admitted finally. "Not just mending and alterations, but creating beautiful gowns and practical everyday where that makes women feel confident." A wistful smile touched her lips. "My mother and I dreamed of that in St. Louis, but we never had the capital to establish such a business." Samuel nodded, his hands continuing their skilled work on the pipe. "Silver Creek could use a proper dressmaker. The ladies there now either order from catalogs or make do with what they can sew themselves." "It's just a dream," Marlene said quickly, suddenly self-conscious about revealing such ambitions. "Dreams are important," Samuel countered seriously. "Without them, we're just surviving, not living." He paused, testing the bowl of the pipe between his fingers. "I've been thinking about what comes next for you, once winter breaks." Marlene's heart sank unexpectedly at the reminder that her stay in Samuel's cabin was temporary, a haven from winter and danger, not a permanent arrangement. "Yes, I should make plans," she agreed, keeping her tone neutral despite the hollow feeling spreading in her chest. "The Petersons' oldest daughter married a shopkeeper in Fort Benton last fall," Samuel continued, seemingly unaware of her emotional shift. "Martha mentioned they have a spare room they've been looking to rent to a respectable woman. It might be a safe place for you, far enough from your husband's usual territory." "Fort Benton," Marlene repeated, trying to sound appreciative of his thoughtfulness while fighting disappointment. "That's very kind of you to consider." Samuel set his carving aside and looked at her directly, his blue eyes serious in the firelight. "Unless you'd prefer to stay." The simple statement hung in the air between them, laden with unspoken meaning. Marlene's breath caught as she searched his face for clarification. "Stay," Samuel leaned forward slightly, his expression earnest. "I've grown accustomed to your company, Marlene, more than accustomed I've come to care for you." The words seemed difficult for him, not from insincerity but from the weight he clearly placed on them. I know it's too soon for you to think of another man that way, especially after what you've endured. But I wanted you to know that this cabin could be your home for as long as you wish it to be, with no expectations beyond what you freely choose to give." Marlene sat very still, absorbing his words and the emotions they stirred within her. Over these winter weeks, Samuel had become more than her rescuer or protector. He had become her friend, her confidant, perhaps even something more that she'd been afraid to name. The contrast between his patient kindness and Edgar's controlling cruelty had revealed to her what a true partnership between a man and woman could be. "I don't know what to say," she finally whispered, overwhelmed by the possibilities his offer presented. "You don't need to say anything now," Samuel assured her, reaching across to briefly touch her hand. "Spring is months away. Just know that when the time comes to decide, you have options beyond running." That night, as Marlene lay in bed listening to Samuel's steady breathing from his bedroll near the fire, she allowed herself to envision a future she hadn't dared imagine before, one where she wasn't constantly looking over her shoulder, where she could build something meaningful with a man who valued her mind and spirit as much as her domestic skills. But the shadow of Edgar Winfield still loomed large in her consciousness. Even if she chose to stay with Samuel, how could they ever truly be free while Edgar hunted for her? The question troubled her dreams and lingered into the gray light of dawn. January gave way to February, and with it came the first subtle signs of winter's eventual retreat. The days grew incrementally longer, and occasionally the temperature would rise enough to partially melt the snow before freezing again overnight. Samuel ventured farther on his trap lines, sometimes staying out until dusk, while Marlene kept the cabin in order and began to plan a small vegetable garden for the spring thaw. Their relationship evolved cautiously during these weeks, like a tender plant slowly unfurling new leaves. Samuel never pressed for more than Marlene was ready to give, but small gestures revealed the deepening of their bond, his hand lingering on her shoulder as he passed behind her chair, her fingers straightening his collar before he left for the day, the way their eyes now met and held across the room in moments of shared understanding. One afternoon in late February, Marlene was alone in the cabin, kneading dough for the evening bread, when she heard the distant sound of approaching hoofbeats. Her heart leapt with automatic fear. Samuel always approached from the north along his trap line, but these sounds came from the east, from the direction of the main trail. Quickly wiping her hands on her apron, Marlene moved to the window, careful to stay partially hidden behind the curtain as she peered out. A lone rider was approaching through the trees, his horse picking its way carefully through the patchy snow. As he drew nearer, Marlene's blood turned to ice in her veins. Edgar. There was no mistaking his rigid posture or the distinctive chestnut gelding he rode. Somehow, despite all their precautions, he had found her. Panic threatened to overwhelm her, but Marlene forced herself to think clearly. Samuel wouldn't return for hours yet. She was alone but not helpless, she reminded herself fiercely. The revolver Samuel had taught her to use hung in its holster by the door. Silently, she retrieved it, checking that it was loaded as Samuel had shown her. Edgar was less than 50 yards from the cabin now. He wouldn't have seen her at the window, but the smoke from the chimney would tell him someone was inside. Marlene positioned herself beside the door, out of sight but ready. Her hands trembled slightly, but her resolve was iron. The hoofbeats stopped, followed by the creak of saddle leather as Edgar dismounted. His boots crunched on the crusty snow as he approached the cabin door. Marlene held her breath, the revolver heavy in her hand. 3 sharp knocks rattled the wooden door. "Hello, the cabin," Edgar called, his voice falsely pleasant. "Anyone home?" Marlene remained silent, praying he might think the occupant was momentarily away and leave, but Edgar was not so easily discouraged. "I can smell fresh bread," he called, a harder edge entering his tone. "And there's smoke from your chimney. Open up." When no response came, Edgar's pretense at civility vanished. "Marlene," he shouted, his voice thick with rage. "I know you're in there. Open this door before I break it down." The door shuddered as he slammed his shoulder against it. The solid construction held, but Marlene knew it wouldn't withstand a determined assault for long. Her mind raced through her limited options. She could try to escape through the back window, but Edgar would surely hear and catch her in the open. She could wait for Samuel, but that might be hours yet, and Edgar's patience was clearly at an end. Or she could confront him on her terms, not his. Drawing a deep breath, Marlene called out, "Step back from the door, Edgar." A momentary silence followed her words, then a low, dangerous laugh. "So you are in there, my darling wife. Open up now, and perhaps I'll forgive your little adventure." "I'm not opening the door," Marlene replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "And I'm not your wife anymore. Go back to your homestead and leave me be." Another slam against the door, harder this time. The wooden bar across it creaked ominously. "You're my wife until I say otherwise," Edgar snarled. "Now open this goddamn door before I break it down and teach you what happens to disobedient women." Marlene raised the revolver, aiming at the door at what would be chest height for a man of Edgar's stature. "I have a gun, Edgar," she warned, surprised by the calm in her voice. "If you break down this door, I'll use it." Edgar's laughter held no humor. "You don't have the spine for it, Marlene. You never did. That's why you ran instead of facing me like a woman grown." Another powerful slam against the door sent splinters flying as the top hinge began to give way. Besides, a proper wife doesn't threaten her husband. She obeys him. The door wouldn't hold much longer. Marlene's finger tightened on the trigger as terror and determination warred within her. "I'm not bluffing, Edgar," she called, her voice rising. "Stay back." "When I get my hands on you," Edgar began, but his threat was cut short by the sudden thunder of rapidly approaching hoofbeats. Marlene's heart leapt with hope and relief as Samuel's voice rang out, cold and authoritative. "Step away from that door and show your hands." Through the damaged door, Marlene could see Edgar wheeling around to face this new threat, his hand dropping instinctively to his hip where he doubtless carried his own weapon. "This doesn't concern you, stranger," Edgar spat. "That's my wife in there, and I've come to take her home." "The lady doesn't seem interested in going with you," Samuel replied, his voice level but dangerous. "I suggest you mount up and ride away while you still can." Marlene could imagine the scene outside Samuel on his horse, rifle at the ready, facing down Edgar who stood before the partially broken door. Two men who couldn't be more different, representing the past she feared and the future she hardly dared hope for. "Who the hell are you to interfere between a man and his wife?" Edgar demanded, his voice thick with fury. "Samuel Blackwood," came the calm reply. "And the lady made her choice when she left you. Now I won't tell you again, back away from the door." A tense silence followed, broken only by the soft nickering of horses and the distant call of a crow. Then Edgar's voice, tight with barely controlled rage. "This isn't over. A man has rights to his own wife. The law's on my side." "The law doesn't give you the right to beat a woman," Samuel countered. "Now get on your horse and go." Another long moment passed before Marlene heard the reluctant scuff of Edgar's boots moving away from the door, followed by the creak of saddle leather as he mounted. "I'll be back," he promised, his voice cold with certainty. "With the sheriff and papers proving she's my lawful wife. We'll see how brave you are then." "I'll be here," Samuel assured him calmly. "Marlene, stay inside until he's gone." Marlene didn't lower the revolver, until the sound of Edgar's horse had faded completely into the distance. Only then did she let out the breath she'd been holding and sink to her knees, the gun trembling in her hand as delayed shock swept through her. The door pushed open gently, its damaged hinge protesting, and Samuel entered, his face tight with concern. Without a word, he knelt beside her and carefully took the revolver from her grip. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his eyes scanning her for any sign of injury. Marlene shook her head, unable to speak past the knot of emotion in her throat. Samuel set the gun aside and gathered her into his arms, holding her securely as the trembling increased and finally gave way to quiet sobs. "You're safe," he murmured against her hair. "You're safe now." But they both knew it wasn't true. Edgar had found them, and he wouldn't give up so easily. The brief peace they'd found in their winter isolation had been shattered, and difficult decisions now lay before them. As the afternoon light faded from the cabin, Samuel set about repairing the damaged door while Marlene mechanically finished the abandoned bread dough and set it to rise. The routine tasks provided some comfort, but the specter of Edgar's threat hung heavy between them. "He meant what he said," Marlene finally broke the silence as she wiped flour from her hands. "He'll be back, perhaps with the sheriff." Samuel secured the last nail in the repaired hinge before turning to face her. "Let him come," he said simply. "We've done nothing wrong, haven't we?" Marlene challenged softly. "In the eyes of the law, I'm still his wife. I've taken no legal steps to end our marriage." "The law isn't always just," Samuel countered, crossing to wash his hands in the basin. "Especially when it comes to matters between husband and wife." He dried his hands thoughtfully. "But you're right that we need to consider our options carefully." "What options do I have?" Marlene asked, genuine despair edging her voice. "If Edgar returns with the sheriff, they can legally force me to go with him. No court would take my word over his about his treatment of me." Samuel leaned against the table, his expression grave but determined. "There's more than one kind of law in the territories, Marlene. Edgar may have legal papers, but that doesn't mean everyone will side with him." He was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing his next words carefully. "We could head farther west, perhaps to Oregon or Washington territory. Start fresh where Edgar has no influence." The suggestion that they might flee together, that Samuel was willing to abandon his home and livelihood to protect her, took Marlene's breath away. "I can't ask that of you," she protested. "This is your home." "Home is more than timber and land," Samuel replied simply. "I've moved before. I can do it again if necessary." The implication behind his words that home might be wherever they were together filled Marlene with a complex mixture of gratitude, hope, and fear. "And what would we be to each other, Samuel, if we left together?" she asked directly, needing clarity in this moment of decision. Samuel met her gaze steadily. "Whatever you want us to be," he answered. "Friends, partners, more if that's what you choose, but I won't press you for promises when you're still legally bound to another man." His honesty and restraint, so different from Edgar's possessive demands, confirmed what Marlene had already begun to recognize in her heart. This man, this kind, principled mountain man who had offered her shelter without expectation, was someone she could trust not just with her safety but with her future. "There might be another way," she said slowly, an idea taking shape as she spoke. "Edgar can't force me to return if I'm married to someone else." Samuel's eyebrows rose in surprise. "That would be bigamy, Marlene. It wouldn't be legal while you're still married to Edgar." "Not in the eyes of the law," she agreed, "but in the eyes of the community. If we were to present ourselves as husband and wife, with the Petersons and others to vouch for us, it might give Edgar pause, especially if he believes we were married before I met him." It was a desperate plan, fraught with risk and built on deception. Yet as Marlene outlined her thinking, Samuel didn't immediately dismiss it. Instead, he listened thoughtfully, his brow furrowed in concentration. "It would mean claiming we've been married for years," he said slowly. "That you fled an abusive situation to return to your true husband. It might work in the court of public opinion, but Edgar would know the truth." "Edgar only knows what I've told him of my past," Marlene pointed out. "I never spoke much of my life before St. Louis. He might believe I had a previous attachment I never revealed." Samuel paced the small confines of the cabin, considering the implications. "It would mean living a lie, Marlene. Are you prepared for that?" The question gave her pause. After Edgar's years of deception and cruelty, the prospect of building a life on another falsehood, however well-intentioned, troubled her. Yet what alternative did she have? Return to Edgar and certain misery, or flee with Samuel into an uncertain future as fugitives? "Perhaps there's a third option," Samuel said suddenly, stopping his pacing. "The circuit judge will be in Silver Creek next month for the spring assizes. What if we petition him directly for a divorce on grounds of cruelty? With witnesses to your condition when you arrived here, and perhaps testimony from others who might have suspected Edgar's treatment of you, we might convince the judge to grant it." Hope flickered in Marlene's chest, but caution quickly tempered it. Edgar would fight it. "He'd never admit to mistreating me." "He might not have to," Samuel mused. "Abandonment is also grounds for divorce in the territory, if we can prove you had just cause to fear for your safety." He trailed off, thinking through the legal complexities. Marlene considered the possibility. A legal divorce would give her the freedom to choose her own path without looking over her shoulder for the rest of her life. It would mean confronting Edgar publicly, exposing the shameful reality of their marriage, but it would also mean a chance at genuine freedom. "It would be a scandal," she said quietly. Samuel's expression softened. "Life out here is hard enough without forcing people to endure private suffering for the sake of appearances," he said. "You might be surprised how many would support your cause." As they talked late into the night, weighing options and risks, Marlene felt a growing sense of resolution. For too long, fear of Edgar had dictated her choices. It was time to take control of her own destiny, whatever the consequences might be. "I want to try for the divorce," she decided finally, as the fire burned low in the hearth. "I want a chance at a life that's truly mine to shape." Samuel nodded, approval and something deeper warming his gaze. "Then that's what we'll do." He reached across the table and took her hand in his, a gesture of solidarity and promise. "Whatever happens, Marlene, you won't face it alone." In that moment, with their hands joined across the rough-hewn table and their future uncertain but filled with possibility, Marlene felt a sensation she had almost forgotten: hope, fragile but persistent, like the first green shoots of spring pushing through winter's snow. March arrived with alternating periods of thaw and freeze that gradually diminished the snow cover around the cabin. As the appointed date for the circuit judge's arrival in Silver Creek approached, Marlene and Samuel prepared their case with meticulous care. Martha Peterson proved an unexpected ally, riding over one clear afternoon with news that bolstered their hopes. "Everyone in the valley knows what kind of man Edgar Winfield is," she confided as they sat at Samuel's table drinking tea. "He's had trouble with neighbors over water rights and boundary disputes. No one trusts him." "But would anyone testify to his character in court?" Samuel pressed. Martha nodded firmly. "Jacob Reese will. Edgar beat one of Jacob's young ranch hands bloody last summer over a stray calf. And the widow Collins says she heard screams from your cabin more than once when passing on her way to visit her son's family." Each confirmation that others had been aware of Edgar's cruelty, filled Marlene with a complicated mixture of shame and vindication. "I never thought anyone knew," she admitted quietly. "We were so isolated." "Word travels in ways you don't expect out here," Martha said, reaching across to pat Marlene's hand sympathetically. "Most folks mind their own business, but that doesn't mean they don't notice." Samuel, who had been listening intently, nodded with satisfaction. "This strengthens our position considerably. With multiple witnesses attesting to Edgar's character and treatment of others, the judge will be more inclined to believe Marlene's account of their marriage." The day before they were to ride into Silver Creek for the court session, Samuel surprised Marlene by producing a small leather pouch from his trunk. "I've been saving these," he explained, emptying several gold nuggets onto the table. "My earnings from last summer's prospecting. I'd planned to use them to expand the cabin come spring, but I think securing your freedom is a better investment." Marlene stared at the gleaming gold, understanding immediately the sacrifice it represented. "Samuel, I can't accept. It's not charity," he interrupted gently. "It's a loan, if you prefer to think of it that way. The judge will require filing fees and will need to stay in town during the proceedings. Once you're free, you can repay me however you see fit." The implicit promise in his words that they had a future in which such debts could be settled wasn't lost on Marlene. "Thank you," she said simply, knowing no other words could adequately express her gratitude. They departed for Silver Creek at dawn the next morning, both dressed in their best clothes, Marlene in a forest green dress Martha had altered for her, Samuel in a clean white shirt and dark waistcoat that transformed him from rugged trapper to respectable landowner. The journey would take most of the day, and they planned to stay at the town's small hotel until the proceedings concluded. As they rode side by side through the awakening spring landscape, Marlene found herself studying Samuel's profile, struck by how quickly he had become the center of her world. In just 3 months, this quiet, principled man had shown her what respect and partnership truly meant. Whatever the outcome of their legal battle with Edgar, she knew she could never return to a life without those essential elements. Silver Creek had grown substantially since its founding 2 years earlier, the silver strike bringing prosperity and population to what had once been little more than a trading post. As they rode down the main street, Marlene took in the wooden sidewalks, the 2-story hotel, the busy general store, and assorted businesses with a mixture of apprehension and fascination. After months of isolation at the cabin, the bustle of even this small frontier town seemed overwhelming. They secured rooms at the hotel, separate accommodations to maintain propriety, and Samuel escorted Marlene to the small law office where they had arranged to meet with Mr. Daniel Hopkins, a young attorney who had agreed to represent her case before the judge. Hopkins proved to be a serious, bespectacled man in his early 30s, clearly intelligent if somewhat inexperienced. He listened attentively as Marlene recounted the details of her marriage to Edgar, taking careful notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions in a manner that was professional but kind. "Yours is not the first such case I've encountered, Mrs. Winfield," he assured her when she had finished her account, "though few women have the courage to seek legal remedy as you're doing." "Will the judge be sympathetic?" Samuel asked directly. Hopkins considered the question carefully. "Judge Calloway is strict but fair. He takes a dim view of men who abuse their authority, whether as officials or as husbands. With the witnesses you've mentioned and Mrs. Winfield's compelling testimony, I believe we have a strong case." He shuffled through his papers thoughtfully. "However, I must warn you that Mr. Winfield has engaged counsel as well. Mr. Thaddeus Grant is representing him, a more experienced attorney with connections in Helena. The news was concerning but not unexpected. Edgar would use every advantage at his disposal to maintain his control. Will that influence the outcome? Marlene asked anxiously. Not with Judge Calloway, Hopkins assured her. He's known for forming his own opinions regardless of who argues before him, but it does mean we must be thoroughly prepared for aggressive questioning. As they left the law office, Marlene felt the weight of the coming confrontation settling heavily on her shoulders. Tomorrow she would face Edgar across a courtroom, with her future hanging in the balance. The prospect was terrifying, yet also strangely liberating. For the first time, she would speak the truth about her marriage publicly, refusing to protect Edgar's reputation at the expense of her own freedom. "Are you all right?" Samuel asked quietly as they walked back toward the hotel, his concern evident in the slight furrow of his brow. Marlene nodded, drawing strength from his steady presence beside her. "I'm afraid," she admitted, "but I'm also ready to be free of him, whatever it takes." Samuel's hand briefly clasped hers, a quick gesture of solidarity that nonetheless sent warmth coursing through her. "You won't be facing him alone," he reminded her. That evening, as Marlene prepared for bed in her small hotel room, a soft knock at her door startled her. Cautiously, she asked, "Who is it?" "It's Martha Peterson," came the reply. "May I come in for a moment?" Relieved, Marlene opened the door to find not only Martha, but also two other women she didn't recognize, one elderly, one closer to Marlene's own age. "I hope you don't mind the intrusion," Martha said as Marlene invited them in. "This is Widow Collins, who I mentioned might testify, and Rebecca Thornton, whose sister was courted by Edgar before he met you." Introductions were made, and then the elderly Mrs. Collins got straight to the point. "We've come to tell you that you're doing the right thing, child," she said firmly. "That man's not fit to be anyone's husband, and more of us should have spoken up when we suspected what was happening in that cabin of his." Rebecca Thornton nodded in agreement. "My sister Clara nearly accepted his proposal 3 years ago, before his true nature revealed itself. She caught him beating his dog for a minor transgression and broke off the courtship immediately. When we heard he'd married a girl from back east, we feared for you, but didn't know how to intervene." The simple knowledge that these women believed her, that they had seen Edgar's character clearly even when she herself had been blinded by his initial charm, brought tears to Marlene's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "You can't know what your support means to me." "We do know," Martha said gently. "Because out here, women have to stand together. The law may give husbands authority over their wives, but that doesn't make cruelty right." She squeezed Marlene's hand. "We'll be in the courtroom tomorrow, and we've spoken with others who will testify if needed. You're not alone in this fight." After the women left, Marlene sat by the window of her room, watching the lamps being lit along Silver Creek's main street as dusk settled over the town. The unexpected visit had fortified her resolve. Tomorrow wouldn't just be about securing her personal freedom. It would be about standing up for the principle that marriage should be a partnership based on mutual respect, not a license for domination and abuse. With that thought firmly in mind, she finally sought sleep, preparing herself for the battle to come. The Silver Creek Courthouse, despite its grand name, was little more than a large room above the general store, hastily converted for the circuit judge's monthly visit. By 10 o'clock the next morning, it was filled to capacity, word having spread about the unusual divorce case to be heard. Marlene sat beside Mr. Hopkins at a small table facing the judge's improvised bench, trying to appear calmer than she felt. Samuel sat directly behind her in the first row of spectators, a reassuring presence at her back. Martha Peterson and several other women from the community occupied seats nearby, their presence a silent statement of solidarity. When Edgar entered with his attorney, a tall, silver-haired man in an expensive suit, Marlene forced herself to look directly at her husband for the first time since her escape. He appeared thinner than she remembered, his face harder, with new lines of bitterness etched around his mouth. When their eyes met across the room, his narrowed with a combination of rage and possessiveness that sent a chill down her spine despite the crowded room. Judge Calloway entered shortly thereafter, a barrel-chested man with iron-gray hair and a no-nonsense demeanor that immediately commanded respect. After calling the court to order, he reviewed the petition before him with careful attention. "This is a petition for divorce on grounds of extreme cruelty and abandonment," he stated, looking over his spectacles at the assembled parties. "Filed by Marlene Winfield against Edgar Winfield after 3 years of marriage." He turned his penetrating gaze to Marlene. "Mrs. Winfield, you understand the seriousness of these allegations and the permanent nature of the remedy you seek." "I do, Your Honor," Marlene replied, her voice steadier than she had expected. The judge nodded. "Very well. Mr. Hopkins, you may present your client's case." What followed was the most difficult ordeal of Marlene's life, recounting in detail, before a room full of strangers, the progressive deterioration of her marriage and the abuse she had suffered at Edgar's hands. She described the isolation, the controlling behavior, the escalating violence, and finally the night Edgar had pressed his revolver to her temple and threatened her life. Throughout her testimony, Edgar sat stone-faced, occasionally leaning to whisper to his attorney but betraying little emotion beyond a tightening of his jaw. When Mr. Hopkins asked Marlene to show the court a scar on her forearm where Edgar had burned her with a cigar during one of his rages, a murmur of shock ran through the spectators. Mr. Grant's cross-examination was as aggressive as Hopkins had warned it would be. The experienced attorney attempted to portray Marlene as emotionally unstable, suggesting she had imagined or exaggerated Edgar's actions and had abandoned her marital duties on a whim. "Is it not true, Mrs. Winfield," Grant asked with barely concealed contempt, "that you fled your husband's home while he was away on business, taking items of value that belonged to him?" "I took only what was mine," Marlene answered firmly. "My mother's brooch, a change of clothing, and the small amount of money I had saved from selling eggs and butter to passing travelers." "And you immediately sought refuge with another man, did you not?" Grant pressed, gesturing toward Samuel in the audience. "A man with whom you have been living in a most improper arrangement for several months." Before Marlene could answer, Judge Calloway intervened. "The court is aware that Mrs. Winfield was rescued from life-threatening exposure by Mr. Blackwood during the November blizzard, Mr. Grant. Unless you have evidence of impropriety beyond the extension of humanitarian aid to a woman in desperate circumstances, I suggest you focus your questions on the substance of the petition." The rebuke visibly rattled the attorney, who shifted tactics to questioning why Marlene hadn't sought help from neighbors if her situation was truly as dire as she claimed. This opened the door for Hopkins to call Martha Peterson, who testified to the isolation of the Winfield homestead and the community's growing concerns about Edgar's character. Jacob Reese followed, describing the brutal beating Edgar had administered to his young ranch hand over a minor dispute. "He didn't just correct the boy," Reese testified gravely. "He enjoyed hurting him. I've been ranching in these parts for 20 years, and I know the difference between necessary discipline and cruelty. What I saw in Winfield's eyes that day was the latter." By the time Samuel took the stand to describe finding Marlene near death in the abandoned mining shack, and the condition she had been in, malnourished, bruised, and terrified, the mood in the courtroom had shifted decisively in her favor. Even Edgar seemed to sense it, his confident posture giving way to tense alertness as the evidence against him mounted. When Edgar finally took the stand in his own defense, his testimony struck Marlene as a perfect encapsulation of the man she had married, superficially reasonable, even charming at moments, but with an undercurrent of cold calculation that she now recognized all too clearly. "My wife has always been high-strung and prone to exaggeration," he told the court smoothly. "I won't deny that our marriage has had its difficulties, as all marriages do, but the picture she's painted here today bears no resemblance to reality." He fixed Marlene with a look of injured innocence. "I've only ever sought to provide for her and protect her, as a husband should. If I've failed in that duty, I ask for the chance to make amends, not to have our sacred union dissolved on the basis of fantasies and misunderstandings." It was a convincing performance, and for a terrible moment, Marlene feared the judge might believe him. But then Edgar made a crucial mistake. When Judge Calloway asked him directly about the revolver incident, Edgar's mask of reasonableness slipped. "If I put a gun to her head, it was only to shock some sense into her," he snapped, his true nature briefly visible beneath the veneer. "A man has the right to discipline his wife as he sees fit. The law recognizes that authority." A ripple of reaction passed through the courtroom at this admission. Judge Calloway's expression hardened visibly. "The law also recognizes limits to that authority, Mr. Winfield," he said coldly. "And threatening your wife's life with a firearm exceeds any reasonable definition of discipline." The remainder of the proceedings passed in a blur for Marlene. Both attorneys made their closing arguments, Hopkins emphasizing the consistent pattern of abuse documented by multiple witnesses, Grant focusing on the sanctity of marriage and arguing that temporary separation, rather than divorce, would be the appropriate remedy. When Judge Calloway finally cleared his throat to deliver his ruling, the crowded courtroom fell completely silent. Marlene felt Samuel's steadying hand on her shoulder as she braced herself for the decision that would determine her future. "Having heard the testimony presented and reviewed the evidence," the judge began, his voice grave, "this court finds that Edgar Winfield has indeed subjected his wife to extreme cruelty that endangered her physical safety and peace of mind. Such treatment constitutes grounds for dissolution of the marriage bonds under territorial law." A wave of relief washed over Marlene so powerfully that she nearly missed the judge's next words. "The petition for divorce is therefore granted. Mrs. Winfield is released from her marital obligations and restored to her maiden status. Furthermore," he continued, raising his voice slightly as Edgar began to protest, "the court orders Mr. Winfield to pay costs of these proceedings and to maintain a distance of no less than 5 miles from his former wife henceforth." He struck his gavel firmly. "This matter is concluded." The finality of those words, "this matter is concluded," echoed in Marlene's mind as Hopkins shook her hand, and the women who had supported her gathered around with congratulations and expressions of relief. She was free. Legally, publicly, irrevocably free. Across the room, Edgar stood rigid with fury, ignoring his attorney's attempts to calm him. His eyes locked with Marlene's one final time, and the hatred she saw there would have terrified her only months before. Now, she met his gaze steadily, refusing to be intimidated. After a long moment, he turned and stormed from the courtroom without a word. Samuel approached as the crowd began to disperse, his expression a mixture of pride and cautious optimism. "It's done," he said quietly. "How do you feel?" Marlene considered the question seriously. "Lighter," she finally answered. "As if I've set down a burden I carried for so long I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand straight." She glanced toward the door through which Edgar had disappeared. "Do you think he'll abide by the judge's order to stay away?" "If he's wise, he will," Samuel replied. "Judge Calloway's rulings are taken seriously in this territory, and Edgar knows it." He offered her his arm. "Shall we go? I imagine you could use some fresh air after all this." As they stepped out onto Silver Creek's Main Street, the afternoon sun warm on their faces, Marlene felt a surge of possibilities opening before her. For the first time in years, her future belonged truly to her, to shape according to her own desires and dreams. "What happens now?" she asked, more to herself than to Samuel. He seemed to understand the deeper question behind her words. "That's entirely up to you," he replied. "You can stay in town if you prefer, start that dressmaking shop you mentioned. The Petersons would help you get established, I'm sure." "And if I wanted to return to the cabin?" Marlene asked carefully, watching his reaction. A smile warmed Samuel's eyes. "Then I'd be honored to have you there, in whatever capacity you choose. As I said before, there are no expectations beyond what you freely offer." The sincerity in his voice touched something deep within Marlene's heart. After all she had endured with Edgar, the simple gift of choice of agency in determining her own path was perhaps the most precious thing Samuel could have offered her. "I'd like to go home," she said softly, the word home carrying a wealth of meaning neither of them missed. "To the cabin. With you." Samuel's hand covered hers where it rested on his arm, a gentle pressure that conveyed more than words could express. "Then that's what we'll do," he said simply. As they walked together through the bustling town toward the hotel where they would spend one last night before returning to the mountains, Marlene reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment. From the desperate woman who had fled into a blizzard with nothing but the clothes on her back, to this, a woman standing tall in the spring sunshine, free to choose her own destiny. And the man beside her, who had once wrapped her in a blanket when she was at her most vulnerable, now offered her something far more valuable, a future built on mutual respect, genuine caring, and the promise of a love that healed rather than harmed. It was a beginning, not an ending. And for the first time in years, Marlene looked toward that beginning with hope rather than fear. Spring unfolded across the Montana territory with a vigor that matched Marlene's own sense of renewal. As April gave way to May, the mountains surrounding Samuel's cabin transformed from austere snowcaps to verdant slopes dotted with wildflowers. In this season of growth and change, Marlene found herself blossoming as well, shedding the last vestiges of the fearful, diminished woman Edgar had tried to create. She and Samuel established new rhythms in their shared life at the cabin. During the day, he would work his claim along the creek or hunt for their table, while she tended the small vegetable garden she'd planted and turned her seamstress skills to improving their modest home. Simple curtains appeared at the windows, a colorful quilt brightened the bed, and cushions softened the wooden chairs, small touches that transformed the bachelor's cabin into a true home. In the evenings, they would sit before the fire, sometimes reading aloud from Samuel's small collection of books, sometimes simply talking. These conversations, ranging from childhood memories to hopes for the future, gradually wove their separate lives into a shared history, creating connections that deepened with each passing day. Though they continued to maintain separate sleeping arrangements, Samuel on his bedroll near the hearth, Marlene in the bed, the growing attraction between them was an almost tangible presence in the cabin. It revealed itself in small moments, their fingers brushing as Samuel passed Marlene a cup of coffee, the way his gaze lingered on her when she wasn't looking, how she found herself watching the play of muscles in his arms as he chopped wood. Yet Samuel never pressed for more, honoring his promise that she would set the pace of their relationship. His patience and respect only heightened Marlene's growing feelings for him, creating a sweet tension that was entirely different from the fear-based dynamics of her marriage to Edgar. One particularly fine May afternoon, as they worked together to repair a section of fence around the garden, Samuel paused, wiping sweat from his brow as he looked out over the valley below. "I was thinking," he said casually, "that the cabin could use an addition before next winter. Another room would give us both more space." The simple statement, with its implication of a shared future extending indefinitely forward, warmed Marlene more than the spring sunshine. "That would be nice," she agreed, setting down her hammer. "Especially if we converted part of it to a proper workspace for my sewing." Samuel nodded, pleased by her enthusiasm. "I thought you might feel that way. Martha mentioned that more folks in Silver Creek have been asking if you'd consider taking on sewing work. Seems your skills have developed quite a reputation." This was true. During their monthly trips to town for supplies, Marlene had begun accepting small commissions, alterations, and simple garments at first, then increasingly complex projects as word of her talent spread. The income, modest though it was, gave her a sense of independence she treasured. "I've been thinking about that too," she admitted. "Not just doing piecework, but perhaps establishing something more formal." "Not immediately," she hastened to add, seeing concern flicker across Samuel's features, "but eventually. A real dressmaking shop in town with regular hours." Samuel considered this thoughtfully. "It would mean spending more time in Silver Creek," he observed. "Maybe even moving there eventually, if the business grew." The potential conflict hung unspoken between them, her ambition for a business that would thrive in town, his preference for the solitude of their mountain home. It was the kind of fundamental difference that might have created insurmountable tension in many relationships. But Samuel surprised her, as he so often did. "We could make that work," he said after a moment's reflection. "Maybe build a small place in town for the busy seasons, keep the cabin for the quieter months and weekends. Best of both worlds." The easy way he accommodated her dreams into his vision of their future touched Marlene deeply. "You wouldn't mind dividing your time between town and here?" she asked. Samuel shrugged, a smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "I go where my heart leads me," he said simply. "And that's with you, Marlene, whether we're in a cabin or a castle." The unadorned honesty of the declaration, the closest he had come to a direct profession of his feelings, left Marlene momentarily speechless. In the golden afternoon light, with the scent of pine and wildflowers in the air, she suddenly saw with perfect clarity what had been gradually building between them over these months of shared work and mutual respect. "Samuel," she said softly, setting down her tools and moving closer to him. "I think it's time we stopped pretending." His eyebrows rose slightly. "Pretending what? That we're just friends? That what's growing between us isn't more than gratitude or convenience?" She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I care for you, Samuel. More than I thought I could ever care for anyone again after what happened with Edgar. And I think I hope you feel the same." The smile that spread across Samuel's face was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "I've loved you since the day you stood up to Edgar at the cabin door," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "But I wanted to give you time to heal, to be sure of your own heart." "I'm sure," Marlene whispered, closing the distance between them. "I've been sure for longer than I've been willing to admit, even to myself." Samuel's hand came up to gently cup her cheek, his calloused palm warm against her skin. "May I kiss you, Marlene?" he asked, the simple request encapsulating everything she had come to love about him, his unfailing respect for her boundaries, his refusal to assume or demand. In answer, she rose on tiptoe and pressed her lips to his in a kiss that began tentatively but quickly deepened, as years of loneliness and months of growing attraction crystallized into this perfect moment of connection. Samuel's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer as she wound her hands into his hair, each of them giving and receiving comfort, desire, and the promise of a future neither had dared fully imagine until now. When they finally drew apart, both slightly breathless, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. "I want to build a life with you, Marlene," he said quietly. "Not as your protector or benefactor, but as your partner in all things. If that's what you want too, I'd be honored to call you my wife when you're ready, and not a moment before." The word wife might have triggered memories of her time with Edgar, but in Samuel's mouth, it carried none of the possessive connotations she had learned to fear. Instead, it sounded like an invitation to equal partnership, to shared dreams and mutual support. "I think I'd like that," she replied, a smile blooming across her face. "But perhaps we could court properly first. I never had that experience with Edgar. Everything happened so quickly." Samuel laughed, the sound rich with happiness. "I'd be delighted to court you, Marlene Miller," he said, using her maiden name with deliberate significance. "Though I should warn you, my courting skills may be a bit rusty." "They seem perfectly adequate to me," she assured him, rising on tiptoe to kiss him again. That evening, as they sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in hues of gold and crimson, Marlene reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment of contentment. From the desperate flight that might have ended in death had Samuel not found her, to this new beginning filled with possibility, it seemed almost like a story from one of Samuel's books rather than her own life. "What are you thinking about?" Samuel asked, his arm comfortably around her shoulders as they shared the porch swing he had built the previous week. "About blankets," she replied with a small smile. Samuel raised an eyebrow questioningly. "The night you found me," Marlene explained, "the first thing you did was wrap me in a blanket. It seemed such a simple thing, but in that moment, it meant everything: warmth, safety, human kindness when I needed it most." She turned to face him more directly. "I think I started falling in love with you then, though I didn't recognize it at the time." Samuel's expression softened with understanding. "Sometimes the simplest gestures carry the most meaning," he agreed. "Though I must admit, when I found you in that shack, romance was the furthest thing from my mind. I was just desperate to keep you alive." "And you did," Marlene said softly, "in more ways than one." Their courtship unfolded through the remainder of spring and into the golden days of summer, a deliberate, unhurried exploration of their deepening feelings for each other. Samuel proved to be a thoughtful suitor, bringing Marlene wildflower bouquets from his trips into the high country, carving delicate wooden trinkets for her during evening hours, and once, memorably, arranging for the traveling peddler to deliver a bolt of fine blue silk that exactly matched her eyes. For her part, Marlene discovered a playfulness in herself she had thought long extinguished. She found joy in surprising Samuel with his favorite meals, in leaving small notes for him to find in his saddlebags, in the simple pleasure of walking hand in hand through the forest as they gathered berries or herbs. Their physical relationship progressed with the same careful respect that characterized all their interactions. Each new intimacy was discussed and mutually agreed upon, each boundary honored without question. For Marlene, who had known only demands and coercion in her previous marriage, this approach was profoundly healing, allowing her to rediscover her own desires without fear. By midsummer, Their shared bed had become as natural and right as their shared life, a sanctuary of tenderness that helped erase the painful memories of her past. In Samuel's arms, Marlene found not just pleasure but a deep sense of homecoming, of being truly known and accepted for exactly who she was. As July ripened into August, they began making concrete plans for their future together. The addition to the cabin was underway, with Samuel and Jacob, Reese's sons, working steadily to create the extra room that would serve as Marlene's sewing workspace. Meanwhile, Marlene had secured a small corner in Silver Creek's general store where she could display samples of her work and meet with potential clients during their monthly visits to town. "We should make it official before winter sets in," Samuel suggested one evening as they reviewed their progress. "Get married, I mean. Pastor Williams will be making his circuit through Silver Creek in September." Marlene nodded, warming to the idea. "A small ceremony," she agreed. "Just our friends from the valley. Maybe in the meadow near the big pine while the wildflowers are still blooming." "Perfect," Samuel said, his eyes crinkling at the corners with pleasure. "And afterward, we could have a gathering here at the cabin. Martha and the other ladies would help with the food, I'm sure." As they discussed the details, Marlene felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This was how such decisions should be made together, with mutual enthusiasm and shared vision, not one person dictating terms to the other. The weeks leading up to their September wedding passed in a flurry of preparations. Marlene worked on her wedding dress in secret moments when Samuel was away, creating a simple but elegant gown of ivory muslin with delicate embroidery at the collar and cuffs. Samuel, with Jacob Reese's help, finished the cabin addition and built a new bed frame large enough for them both, carving intricate patterns of mountain flowers into the headboard as a surprise for his bride. The morning of their wedding dawned clear and crisp, with just a hint of autumn in the air. As Marlene dressed in the Peterson cabin, where she had spent the previous night in accordance with tradition, Martha and several other women from the valley bustled around her, offering advice and adjusting her hair. "You look radiant, dear," Martha declared, stepping back to admire the finished effect. Marlene's honey-brown hair was arranged in soft waves beneath a crown of late-summer wildflowers, and the ivory dress complemented her sun-kissed complexion perfectly. "Samuel won't know what hit him." "I still can't quite believe this is happening," Marlene admitted, smoothing the skirt of her gown nervously. "That I could be this fortunate." "It's not fortune," Martha corrected gently. "It's what you deserve, what every woman deserves. A man who values you as an equal and treats you with respect." She squeezed Marlene's hand. "Samuel is one of the good ones. I knew it the first time Jim introduced us, years ago. He just needed the right woman to complete him." The simple validation brought tears to Marlene's eyes. "Thank you," she whispered, "for everything. I don't know what would have happened to me without friends like you." "That's what community means," Martha replied practically, handing Marlene a handkerchief to dab her eyes. "Now, let's not keep your groom waiting." "Jacob says Samuel's been pacing like a caged mountain lion all morning." The meadow near the big pine had been transformed for the occasion. Simple wooden benches arranged in a semicircle provided seating for the 30 or so guests' neighbors from up and down the valley who had, over the past months, become Marlene's extended family. At the center, beneath the spreading branches of the ancient pine, Pastor Williams waited with Samuel, whose nervous expression dissolved into pure joy as Marlene appeared at the edge of the clearing on Jacob Reese's arm. The simple ceremony, conducted against the backdrop of Montana's towering mountains and endless sky, perfectly reflected the straightforward honesty of their relationship. They exchanged traditional vows, their voices clear and sure in the mountain air, and rings Samuel had commissioned from a silversmith in Helena plain bands inscribed with a single word: always. When Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel's kiss was both tender and passionate, a public declaration of private promises that brought approving smiles from their assembled friends. As they turned to face their guests, now officially Mr. and Mrs. Blackwood, Marlene felt a sense of completion she had never experienced before, as though the final piece of a complex puzzle had clicked into place, revealing a picture of unexpected beauty. The celebration that followed at their cabin lasted well into the evening, with music from Jacob's fiddle, plenty of food prepared by the women of the valley, and even some dancing on the packed earth of the yard. As dusk fell, lanterns were lit around the perimeter, casting a golden glow over the festivities that continued until the last guest departed with congratulations and good-natured teasing for the newlyweds. Finally alone in their cabin, their home, Samuel and Marlene stood in the doorway, watching the last lantern light disappear down the trail as Jacob and Martha headed home. "Well, Mrs. Blackwood," Samuel said softly, turning to his wife with a smile that held both tenderness and desire, "it seems we've successfully begun our life together." Marlene leaned into his embrace, feeling the solid strength of him against her. "I think we began it the night you found me in that abandoned shack," she replied. "Everything since has just been the natural unfolding of what started then." Samuel nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps you're right, though I must say I prefer this chapter to those early days of uncertainty." "As do I," Marlene agreed, rising on tiptoe to kiss him, "though I'm even more excited about the chapters yet to come." As they closed the cabin door on the outside world and turned toward their shared future, Marlene reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this moment of perfect happiness. From a marriage filled with fear and control, she had escaped into uncertainty and danger, only to find unexpected salvation in the form of a blanket offered by a kind stranger. That simple act of human decency had been the first thread in a tapestry they had woven together over the subsequent months, a tapestry rich with shared work and mutual respect, with laughter and healing, with the gradual discovery of a love neither had been looking for but both had desperately needed. Now, as Samuel gathered her into his arms to carry her across the threshold of their bedroom, not as a gesture of possession, but as one of partnership and celebration, Marlene knew with absolute certainty that the life they would build together would be everything her first marriage had not: equal, respectful, and filled with a love that liberated rather than confined. The blanket that had once saved her from the killing cold had become something far more profound, a life wrapped in warmth, security, and the enduring promise of love freely given and joyfully received. Spring came early to the Montana Territory in 1880, bringing with it new beginnings for the Blackwood family. As the first anniversary of their wedding approached, Marlene stood at the window of their expanded cabin, one hand resting lightly on her swelling abdomen as she watched Samuel chopping wood in the yard. The past year had been one of steady growth, both of their relationship and their practical circumstances. Marlene's dressmaking business had flourished beyond her initial hopes. What had begun as a small corner in Silver Creek's general store had expanded to a proper shop of her own when the former milliner retired and offered her the space. 3 days a week, Marlene would make the now easier journey into town, thanks to the new road Samuel and some neighbors had cut through the forest, reducing the travel time significantly. Samuel, meanwhile, had discovered an unexpected talent for crafting fine furniture, an extension of the whittling skills he had always possessed. His carefully made tables, chairs, and cabinets had found eager buyers among Silver Creek's more prosperous citizens, providing a steady income to supplement what they earned from his trapping and her sewing. Together, they had achieved a balance that honored both their needs, the peace and beauty of their mountain home, and the social and economic opportunities of the growing town. Their cabin, now a proper three-room dwelling with glass windows and a stone fireplace, represented the physical manifestation of their partnership, solid, harmonious, and built to last. But the most significant development was the child now growing beneath Marlene's heart, due to arrive in the early summer. The discovery of her pregnancy had brought both joy and momentary trepidation. Memories of Edgar's drunken talk about breeding her had briefly resurfaced, casting a shadow over what should have been purely happy news. Samuel, with his characteristic sensitivity, had understood without explanation. "This child will be born of love and welcomed as a blessing," he had assured her, his hand covering hers where it rested on her still flat stomach. "Never a possession or an obligation." His words had dispelled her fears, allowing excitement to flourish as her body changed, and the reality of impending parenthood settled over them both. Now, in her 6th month, Marlene could feel the baby's movements, little flutters and kicks that connected her to the new life they had created together. As she watched Samuel stack the split wood against the side of the cabin, his movements sure and efficient in the spring sunshine, a wave of contentment washed over her. This was what security felt like, not the false security of Edgar's financial provision, which had come with such a terrible price, but the true security of partnership with a man who valued her independence as much as their connection. Samuel glanced up, catching her watching him, and his face broke into the warm smile that still made her heart skip a beat. He set down his axe and crossed to the porch, brushing sawdust from his hands. "How are my two favorite people this morning?" he asked, climbing the steps to join her at the window. "Active," Marlene replied with a laugh, taking his hand and placing it where the baby was performing what felt like somersaults. "I think we may have an acrobat on our hands." Samuel's expression of wonder as he felt the movement never failed to touch her deeply. "Amazing," he murmured, "to think we created this life together." The simple statement reflected what Marlene had come to treasure most about their relationship, the sense of creating together, whether it was a child, a home, or the pattern of their daily lives. Every decision was shared, every challenge faced as a team. "Martha stopped by while you were checking the North Trap line yesterday," Marlene mentioned as they moved inside to the kitchen, where coffee percolated on the stove. "She brought a cradle her husband made for us, a beautiful piece of cherry wood with a hand-quilted lining." "That was thoughtful of them," Samuel said, pouring coffee for them both. "The Petersons have been good friends to us." "The best," Marlene agreed, settling into a chair at the kitchen table. "Martha said something interesting, though. She said she'd never seen two people more suited to each other than we are, that we seem to fit in a way few couples manage." Samuel considered this as he sat across from her. "I think she's right," he said after a moment, "though it's not just luck or natural compatibility. We work at understanding each other, at making space for both our needs." He reached across to take her hand. "That's something I learned from you, Marlene, how to truly share a life rather than just occupying the same space." The observation, so characteristic of Samuel's thoughtful nature, highlighted how far they had both come since that snowy night when fate had brought them together. Samuel had given Marlene safety when she most needed it, but she had given him something equally valuable: companionship that enriched his solitary existence and pushed him to grow in ways he hadn't anticipated. "I've been thinking," she said, running her thumb over his calloused palm, "about names for the baby." Samuel smiled encouragingly. "Any particular ones you favor? If it's a boy, I'd like to name him after your father, James, wasn't it?" Samuel nodded, clearly touched by the suggestion. "And if it's a girl, Hope," Marlene said simply, "because that's what she would represent, the hope that brought us together and the hope we have for the future." "James or Hope Blackwood," Samuel tested the names aloud. "Both sound right to my ear." As they continued their morning routine, Samuel heading out to finish the wood splitting, Marlene returning to the dress. She was making for Martha's daughter the comfortable rhythm of their shared life, wrapped around them like the blanket Samuel had once offered a desperate stranger. That evening, as a spring storm rolled through the valley, bringing much-needed rain to the awakening land, they sat before the fire in the main room of their cabin. Samuel worked on a small wooden horse he was carving for the baby, while Marlene finished hemming a tiny gown. "I had a letter from Rebecca Thornton today," Marlene mentioned, setting her sewing aside for a moment. "She says Edgar Winfield finally left the territory. Apparently, he sold his homestead to a family from Minnesota and headed for California." Samuel looked up from his carving, his expression a mixture of relief and caution. "That's welcome news if true. Did she say what prompted his departure?" Marlene shook her head. "Just that he'd been increasingly bitter since the divorce, drinking heavily and alienating whatever neighbors still dealt with him." She unconsciously placed a protective hand over her belly. "If he's truly gone, it would lift the last shadow from our happiness." For despite the joy of their life together, the possibility of Edgar's return had remained a faint but persistent worry at the back of Marlene's mind. Judge Calloway's order had kept him at a distance, but the knowledge that he still harbored resentment had occasionally disturbed her peace. "We'll ask Jim to confirm it next time he's in Helena," Samuel said practically. "If Edgar has indeed left Montana, then we can finally close that chapter completely." Marlene nodded, returning to her sewing with a lighter heart. The prospect of Edgar's permanent absence from their lives, combined with the imminent arrival of their child, seemed to mark the final transition from her past to her future. As spring deepened into early summer, the confirmation did indeed come. Edgar Winfield had departed for California, leaving behind a homestead run to ruin and a reputation no one mourned. The news coincided with the final preparations for the baby's arrival, lending an additional sense of rightness to this new beginning. On a perfect June morning, with sunlight streaming through the bedroom window and a meadowlark singing in the pine outside, Marlene gave birth to their daughter after a long but uncomplicated labor. Samuel had remained by her side throughout, his steady presence a source of strength during the difficult hours. "She's perfect," he whispered, tears streaming unashamedly down his face as he held his daughter for the first time. "Absolutely perfect." Hope Elizabeth Blackwood, named for both the emotion that had sustained her parents through difficult times and for Samuel's mother, had her father's blue eyes and a dusting of her mother's honey-brown hair. From her first moments, she displayed a calm alertness that seemed to take in everything around her with thoughtful interest. As Marlene recovered her strength in the days following the birth, supported by visits from Martha Peterson and the other women of the valley who brought food, advice, and helping hands, she was struck by the contrast between this experience of vulnerability and the isolation she had endured during her years with Edgar. Here, surrounded by a community that genuinely cared for her well-being and a husband who approached her postpartum needs with tender solicitude, she understood more deeply than ever before the difference between mere survival and truly living. This was what she had been seeking when she fled into that November blizzard, not just escape from cruelty, but the chance to build a life filled with meaning and connection. By the time Hope was a month old, Marlene had recovered enough to resume some of her normal activities, though she had decided to limit her time at the dressmaking shop until the baby was older. Samuel had built a cradle that could be easily transported, allowing Hope to accompany them on their trips to town or to visit neighbors. One particularly beautiful evening in late July, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the western sky in shades of gold and crimson, Hope sleeping peacefully in Marlene's arms, Samuel turned to his wife with an expression of such deep contentment that it brought tears to her eyes. "I never imagined this," he admitted quietly. "When I came west after the war, I thought I was choosing solitude, that a family wasn't in my future. I'd seen too much death, too much suffering to believe I could ever." He trailed off, searching for words. "Ever trust life enough to create more of it?" Marlene suggested gently. Samuel nodded, his gaze moving from her face to their sleeping daughter. "Exactly. I built this cabin as a refuge from the world, not as a home to share." He reached out to stroke Hope's tiny hand, which reflexively curled around his finger. "But then you appeared in that abandoned shack, half frozen but still fighting, and everything changed." "For both of us," Marlene acknowledged. "I had given up on the idea that marriage could be a partnership of equals, that a man could be strong without being controlling, protective without being possessive." She leaned her head against his shoulder. "You taught me otherwise, Samuel." With every kindness, every respect shown, every decision shared. They sat in companionable silence as the last light faded from the sky and the first stars appeared overhead. In the distance, a coyote called to its mate, the sound echoing through the valley that had become their home in every sense of the word. "The night I found you," Samuel said thoughtfully, "I gave you a blanket because it was the most immediate need, protection from the cold that would have claimed your life." Marlene nodded, remembering the feel of that rough woolen blanket as he'd wrapped it around her trembling form. "It saved me," she said simply. "Perhaps," Samuel continued, his arm tightening around her shoulders, "but what I've come to understand since then is that you saved me too, Marlene. From a different kind of cold, the isolation I had accepted as my lot in life." He pressed a gentle kiss to her temple. "You gave me the courage to open my heart again, to build something I thought was beyond my reach." As Hope stirred in her arms, making the small sounds that preceded waking, Marlene reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect contentment. From a marriage filled with fear, she had escaped into uncertainty, only to find unexpected salvation in the form of a blanket and the man who offered it. That simple act of kindness had been the foundation upon which they had built this life together, a life characterized by mutual respect, shared purpose, and a love that continued to deepen with each passing day. The blanket that had once saved her from the cold had become something far more profound, a metaphor for the warmth, security, and enduring promise of a love freely given and joyfully received. As Hope opened her eyes, regarding her parents with the solemn gaze that already seemed to hold wisdom beyond her weeks, Marlene felt the final pieces of her healing fall into place. The fear that had once defined her existence had been replaced by confidence, the isolation by community, the pain by joy. "I love you," she said simply to Samuel, the words encompassing not just emotion but gratitude for all he had brought into her life. "And I love you," he replied, the depth of feeling in his voice matching her own. "Yesterday, today, and all our tomorrows." In that moment, with her husband beside her and their daughter in her arms, Marlene knew with absolute certainty that the life they had created together, this beautiful tapestry, woven from threads of hardship overcome and happiness earned, was more precious than anything she could have imagined when she first fled into that winter storm. From the ashes of a marriage filled with fear had risen something remarkable, a partnership based on equality, a family founded on love, and a future limited only by the horizons they chose to set for themselves. The cowboy who had once handed her a blanket had given her far more than temporary warmth. He had given her a life full of love, and in doing so, had found his own heart's home as well.